عندي 106 سنين 106 سنين الحمد لله.
Welcome to Meet Us on the Abraham Path. I'm Anisa Mehdi, Executive Director of the Abraham Path Initiative. I join you today from the shores of a lake in Maine. This is the northeasternmost state in the United States. And here we're just a few miles from the Appalachian Trail, which is the world's longest hiking-only footpath at about 2,200 miles long. Now, since 2007, the Abraham Path Initiative has worked with local partners to develop walking trail in Southwest Asia, more commonly called the Middle East. And we've developed about 1,200 miles of trail so far from Sinai going eastward to the Kurdish region of northern Iraq. Our first adventures in trail development and scouting were in Jordan and in Turkey. And today we focus on Turkey. And here I will introduce you to our guest today, Joshua Weiss, the current chair of the board of directors of the Abraham Path Initiative. And Josh was there at the very beginning. Welcome, Josh.
Thank you very much, Anisa. How are you?
I'm doing fine today. So it's an exciting time for Josh, who is not merely the chair of our board. He was managing director of the organization in its early years. He is a senior fellow at the Harvard Negotiation Project and co-founder of the Global Negotiation Initiative at Harvard, and teaches leadership and negotiation at Bay Path University. But even more exciting than that, or maybe equally, is the release of your new book, Josh. Congratulations. The book of real-world negotiations, successful strategies from business, government, and daily life. Will you tell us just a bit about your new book?
Sure. Very briefly, I mean, the book is, one of the things that I've learned over the years is that stories are an amazing way to convey lessons and to help people to learn new ideas and concepts. And so in this book, I set out to find real stories of negotiations that are happening around the world in the business context, government, it's outside of that, and some hostage negotiations, to try to help people to really understand what effective negotiation looks like in practice. And I think that when you use stories as opposed to theories or concepts, the message comes through loud and clear. And so I was really pleasantly surprised by the cases and how they all came together and the terrific lessons. And I think when people hopefully read it and put it down, they'll have a very different conception of how do you deal with some really difficult negotiation issues that look like there is no solution, and yet with persistence and creative thinking, solutions emerge.
Well, it's interesting you raised the thought that there may be no solution. The Abraham Path Initiative focuses our work on the area we call the Middle East, with all of its impossible situations, apparently impossible situations. I tend to call it Southwest Asia, Josh, just to get away from all of those impossibilities that come flooding to mind when we say the Middle East. So why did we pick that crazy, fraught region?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and a lot of people said to me, if you're thinking about creating sort of a long distance walking route, why would you do it in a region that is rife with conflict as well as beauty? I mean, I think that's one of the things that people will see through this presentation today. But if they actually do walk on the path, is it's a land of juxtapositions. There's those challenges that we know about, but there's also the amazing hospitality, the amazing people, the landscapes, the beauty, etc. Why we picked the region was because back in 2003, at the end of 2003, this idea was hatched by William Ury, my colleague and friend, and yours as well. And the idea was that the United States had just gone into Iraq, and it seemed as if the world was there was a chasm that was developing between the West and the Middle East. As you mentioned in sort of common lexicon. And the idea was to say, well, we're sort of these negotiation people, conflict resolution folks, like, what is it that we can contribute outside of, say, the governmental realm? And the idea came up to try to sort of recreate or dust off the footsteps of Abraham as a way of connecting people from the West to the Middle East region and to get people to come and see it and understand it differently. There's a lot of perceptions, there's a lot of beliefs about the region, and yet when you go and experience it, you realize a lot of those are very different. And so, what better way to do that than actually walking and engaging with people in a very personal kind of way? And so the path was really, in so many ways, an effort to try to build a bridge between the West and those folks who live in the region, and to try to help create better understanding amongst those different groups.
Yeah, I've got a whole bunch of questions that as executive director I probably shouldn't ask, but as a reporter I'm compelled to. And um, uh, one of them is really related to today, and maybe to direct that. We created the Abraham Path Initiative with a sense of movement as a way to build bridges.
Mm-hmm.
Movement isn't happening these days.
Yeah.
How do we continue to do that important work? You and I and the board of directors may know, but let's bring our viewers in on this, really. So what are we compelled to do now that people aren't able to travel so easily?
Sure. Well, I think first and foremost, I mean, again, the Abraham Path was all about understanding. And the idea was understanding through movement, engagement, personal interaction, and things along those lines. As you say, for different reasons, COVID in particular, that kind of movement isn't happening. But the good thing is that the virtual world enables us to continue. When physical borders are blocked, the virtual world creates an avenue and an opening for people to continue to learn and to understand each other. And so through webinars like this, through short videos we've made, through other kinds of virtual mediums, we can continue to create a place where people can understand each other better and differently. And really, that's true to the mission of the path, first and foremost. It was really, that was the essence of it, was to break down those boundaries, because when you know people or you understand a culture or a background better, you're much more likely to challenge it when something comes up that maybe is questionable, and et cetera. So I think that the virtual absolutely gives us that opportunity to continue the mission of the path until that day when we can all get our feet back onto the sands and the donkey paths and the villages of the region.
That's terrific, Josh. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is, we're not a religious organization, yet we have the name Abraham, and what you alluded to, connecting us all, is that mythology, the legend of Abraham. And in fact, when you bring us to Turkey, as you're going to do in just a few minutes, we're going to be visiting the birthplace, or one of the alleged birthplaces, of Abraham. So parse apart for us all how we're not a religious organization, we're not interfaith dialogue, and yet the example that we use is a religious figure.
Well, the religious figure of Abraham, I mean, the reason that Abraham came up was because, in particular, William and colleagues at a dinner trying to think about what they could do, sort of said, well, where are those commonalities? Where are those intersections between the West and the Middle East region, as it was called? And they started to think, well, are there figures that are iconic in some ways, not iconic in the idolatry sort of sense, but people that both societies, both worlds understand and revere in some way, shape, or form. And they started to think about it, and frankly, they only had to go back 4,000 years to find a figure that worked for both of those worlds, that people grasped. And I think, in the West, Abraham is a figure that obviously is at the heart of the three monotheistic religions that came from his journey and his story. And yet in the Middle East region, Abraham in so many ways is a living figure. It's interesting because I recall when I started traveling there, particularly to Turkey, which we'll talk about, Abraham was not just some notion out here that was found in the text. He was a living figure that people were named after. Historical sites were connected to. When you uttered his name, the notion of hospitality came springing to mind for the people there. So I think that the figure of Abraham proved to be that link that I think unites us, but has been broken. And the more we can say, hey, we all understand the story of Abraham, we understand it differently, but we all have a connection to it. And it's that connection that begins to plant a seed that can grow in terms of understanding and realizing that there are things that I could be living in Boston, Massachusetts, and somebody could be living in a very small town near Şanlıurfa in southeastern Turkey, and we have something in common. I remember the first time I went to the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. We were sitting around a campfire with some of our Bedouin friends, and we asked one of the Bedouin guides to tell us a story about their perspective on Abraham and Ibrahim. And he started to tell the story that I knew. And here's a person that grew up in the middle of the Sinai, and I knew the same story. And so when you have that, you immediately begin to say, well, wait a minute, if we share that, what else do we share? And I think that has proven to be something that has enabled people to connect when they probably didn't think there was much connecting to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And I remember also sometimes, just to revert to when you said that Abraham's a living figure. Sometimes you go into a small town and you call for Ibrahim, which is Abraham in Arabic, and half the little boys in the neighborhood turn around or come and yell at, come and say, yes, madam, I love you,
Right.
hello.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Right.
everybody's after him. Yeah. So let's get started looking at our intervention or our explorations of Turkey. The first places that you and the early teams went to do trail development was in Jordan. The two places were Jordan and Turkey. And we're going to start by showing our visitors, our guests today, a short film called From Uvajala to Urfa. And I want you to be looking, friends, and also look at your chat, your question section in the control panel and your drop-down control, so you can be thinking of questions to offer to Josh during our conversation today. Let's take a look at that video.
Hazreti İbrahim Urfa'nın hayatında çok önemli bir yer, mekandır. Herkes Hazreti İbrahim'le ilgili çok sayıda hikaye bilir. Şu anda bulunduğumuz mekan Hazreti İbrahim'in doğduğu mağaradır. Bu mağara bu açıdan çok önemli. İnsanlar buraya sürekli ziyarete gelirler. İnsanlara mesajı da budur zaten. Dostluktur, kardeşliktir, insanlıktır.
Merhaba.
İşte Urfa'dan da Hazreti İbrahim'den dolayı böyle bir kültür koridoru oluşturuluyor. Oluşturulan bu kültür yolu da tabii ki Urfalılara, herkese fayda sağlayacak.
İbrahim yolu که خواهی daha faydalı مرا İnsana nasıl ki daha bilinçli de ben daha هاي دنيا میسان دنیا گیناست کن بر حرمت دیکن این تاب هوالتی دیکن تا خوشه دهازم کفر ده میسان ورا داره تیم هین در ناس دیکن ده خوشه ده
Zarri me heyecanlı ne yani mesela diyelim ki insan işte öğrenem işte bine şey falan diken emzan yani bütün din birleşmiş hevkirne vanra diyaloga giriye ke bu biber bu şey çay kek
Olive, elma, elma, zeytin.
çok güzel
Ekmek, evet. Eine kurmancı.
kurmancı
So you don't forget us.
yani bütün din olarak çünkü bu diyem çare ki beni perzirindi be.
What a lovely sentiment at the end there, and I think a lot of us can relate to that. This film raises so many wonderful and uniting ideas of the Abraham Path. One is the economic benefit to the local people, and also how their children look forward to guests coming, and how we then, the visitors, are also enlightened and empowered from it. Josh, we have a question here already from Rizvan Khan, who is curious to know, how can people continue to help people who live off tourism along the path under these circumstances? Because clearly it is something that's appreciated.
Yeah, it's a really important question, and we've one of the things that we've been trying to do is just that by raising resources so that we can continue to help folks along the path. In general, the idea is that we can help to provide them with some resources now, so that down the road they'll be able to continue to host folks, etc. So if folks can make a donation to the path, that's certainly one way, and that's something that we're doing with the Abraham Path Initiative to help try to keep things going for folks, because their livelihood in large part does depend on this. And so that's absolutely one way to do it.
Yeah, we've done some of that. We're calling it paying it forward. We've also engaged various members, service providers who are homestay hosts, as Josh mentioned, and guides, to join us on our webinars and to tell their stories through our postcards. And this is also we're hiring them to do that. So it's a work, and it's a dignified way to earn some money by sharing the stories, which keeps our mission intact, as Josh had mentioned a few minutes ago. But we've also been talking, and as we've been talking to people on our webinar series, there's hope that we'll be walking again in the spring, at least. And so our tour operators who have been on the show, for example, have encouraged you to look at your travel plans for the spring and begin to pull yourself together and your courage too, because sometimes it takes a little of that to go forward under circumstances like these. But it also takes courage, I will assert, to go into a country, a land that you're unfamiliar with, and knock on someone's door and say, "Hi, I'm here with the Abraham Path Initiative. How would you like us to come walking through your town?" Josh, what's it like to do that early work?
Yeah, it is different, that's for sure. And I think in particular, it's different because because Şanlıurfa is in the southeastern part of Turkey. It's not Istanbul or Ankara. And when people think about Istanbul or Ankara, they tend to think about westernized sort of cities in many ways, and they are. But Şanlıurfa is very, very different. It's a much more conservative part of the country. And so when we started to think about this and to talk to people about it, a lot of people had said to us, why would you want to go to Urfa? It's not very welcoming in some ways to people from the outside world. And what we actually found was that wasn't true. on a number of fronts. We found that there was a perception of URFA. And once the thing is that in general, when you're coming from the West, from outside the region, and talking about a project like this, the Middle East, the area that's known as that, or Southwest Asia, as Anisa talks about it, has seen a lot of these projects come. And some of them are what they say they are, and others are not. So there's a healthy dose of sort of suspicion when it comes to these kinds of projects. And one of the most important things I think you can do when you're beginning down a road of trying to engage folks, because for us, I think it's really important to say that we never saw ourselves as the ones that would, quote unquote, build the Abraham Path. I mean, first of all, the Abraham Path existed and existed for a very long time. The question was, could you revitalize it in a way where people saw it as something they could come and walk, sort of like the Appalachian Trail? But the other really important piece to this is that for this to last, and our belief was that this wasn't a few-year project, this wasn't a decade project, this was a centuries-long project. And the hope was that it would last for many, many years. And for that to be the case, our role was more about partnering with people on the ground and getting people in the villages and the cities and the towns where the path ran to run with it and to own this, because they were going to be the ones that were going to nurture it. So we never had any illusions about the notion that we weren't going to build this. We were going to assist, we were going to help where we could. We're going to try to raise resources to do this. But for us, it was very much about finding partners. And of course, that's difficult when you work in a place and you go to a place that, as I said, starts with a little bit of suspicion. And I do think it's important to note, that the Abraham Path, the beginnings of the Abraham Path, were at the Global Negotiation Initiative at Harvard. And I think Harvard was a really critical piece to this puzzle, because I think had we showed up without Harvard as a backdrop, I don't know whether people would have taken us seriously, etc. And
Yeah.
so,
Josh, let me interject a question right
Please.
now as we're hearing this, and maybe you want to come on camera for a sec to answer it.
Sure.
I mean, people have been asking questions from the audience, really looking at, especially when you mentioned Harvard and negotiation and so on. Were we premised? Talk about the people want to know, is this organization bent on creating peace?
So
Is that really our final agenda here?
Well, I think that the agenda has always been to try to create an opportunity for people from around the world to come and understand the Middle East region better, differently, to understand the people, the culture, and the history. That is the agenda of the Abraham Path. Might that lead to more peaceful relationships between people? Potentially, yes. But the mission was really about understanding. It was about trying to break down some of the barriers and the stereotypes that exist between people from very different worlds and very different places. So I would describe it in that way. And that was what was always motivating us. And again, it was also, for us, when we started down this road, we started working within each of the countries where the path went. The path of Abraham was there long before borders, long before many things. And so for us, our whole goal was to follow the path. It wasn't for us to judge if it went in certain places. If there was a mythology or a lore or a perspective on where Abraham wandered, we sought to include that in what we were doing. And so, and that's why we were always open to the different narratives that exist. And there are very different narratives related to the story of Abraham or Ibrahim. And I think Turkey is a really good place to discuss some of those, because I think there are some of those narratives that sit side by side.
Well, take it away.
Okay. So I think one of the interesting things, I know for myself, one of the interesting things about Turkey in particular was that it was a place of really sort of hidden wonders and quite amazing sights and landscapes and people. And that's what we sort of encountered. But to give people a bit of a context of where the path is, I mentioned that Istanbul and Ankara are toward the west, and Şanlıurfa is quite far in the southeastern part of the country. It's about 40 kilometers from the Syrian border, etc. And the southeast is also very, very diverse in its landscape and also its people. So the landscape, is more flat. It's dotted with what are called tells. So tells are small hills that are actually typically at the base of many villages where deposits from the past kind of exist. So a lot of the tells are these hills that in part protect the villages a little bit from some of the weather and the terrain, and were used in the past to live on, so that if enemies were coming, you might have a bit of a strategic advantage. But one of the interesting things about these tells is that when it rains, lots of pieces of pottery, flints, and other kinds of shards from history start to fall off of the hill because it's really a bearing of a centuries-old landscape that exists there. So the Southeast is also, from the point of view of people, there are Turks, there are Kurds, there are Arabs. So there are a lot of different people with very different backgrounds, very different approaches to life. And one of the interesting parts of the path is that it traversed those different places. So the path went from Yuvajala, which is a Kurdish village, down past a place called Kisas, which we'll talk a little bit about in a bit, which is an Alawite village, which is Alawites, for those of you who don't know, is a small sort of minority sect of Islam. And then into Haran, which is much more of an Arab-oriented village in their background and approach to things. So, and that's unusual in a 250, 300 kilometer area to have that much diversity of people and backgrounds and approaches. When we started working there, one of the things that we had to understand also was that they still used a feudal system. So a feudal system is one where there's still a chief or chieftain who oversees a big swath of area, and people working under those chiefs. We also had to understand that area of the path was governed by what's often referred to as an honor culture. So honor cultures are those where people's honor is front and center, and if something were to happen to that honor, there needs to be ways to restore that honor. And unfortunately, sometimes that leads to violence and other things, but certainly not always. And certainly that honor culture is also at the heart of the hospitality that drives the people in the region. So I would be sort of remiss if I didn't talk about some of the important players in the development of the path, because there were a lot. And I think that in many ways, it was fascinating to see the different characters that we came across. So when we got started, I would say it's fair to say that it's very difficult to do something like this and to not make some mistakes. And so I think one of the mistakes that we made early on was actually that we had contacts in Istanbul and Ankara, and they gave us advice and thoughts about how to work in Urfa. And in many ways, they had a different mindset than folks in Urfa. And so early on, we took their advice, and we realized that we ended up having some problems and challenges as a result of that. And there was a learning curve there. And so one of the things that we did, because we were getting essentially, a lot of people were saying to us, this is an interesting idea. In 2004 and 5 at Harvard, we took time to try to study whether this was even possible. And a lot of people were saying, it's an interesting idea, but we really don't think it can be done. And so William, Murray, and myself and others talked about, well, I think we need to show people that it can be done. And so we ended up doing what we called the Harvard Study Tour, where in 2006 we had 24 people from 10 countries who ended up traveling, beginning in Urfa and traveling to Syria, Jordan, Palestine and Israel, to hold a series of consultative meetings with people along the path. And when we did that initial meeting in Urfa, we made some mistakes. There was a real concern about whether this was a very religious project and whether there were thoughts on taking over territory. Those were some of the rumors that came about. And so we realized early on after that we needed to do some damage repair, if you will, to go back to the communities and talk to them about and make sure that they understood what this was really all about. And so the person on the bottom of your screen, Mehmet Oymak, was a really central figure. He was one of the narrators in the video that you watched. And Mehmet was a scholar of Abraham, and he was very well connected in Urfa. He was really a critical person early on for us to get connected with people and to give the project credibility there with the local people, because they all knew him. And it turned out later that he became a representative of the AKP, which is the ruling party in Turkey, which again gave some standing to the project. The next person I want to introduce you to is a woman named Arzu Yilmaz. So Arzu is certainly one of my favorite people on the path. Arzu is a Kurd from Ankara who we got to know, and she accompanied William on the very first trip in 2004, 2005 to Haran. And Arzu was a remarkable person because she grew up in Ankara, but she had a way of connecting to people in Urfa that I would say, again, gave us the credibility and the ability to interact and engage early on. Now, one of the things that happened early on was that we tried to put together a local committee. But if you recall, I mentioned that the world that a lot of the people out there lived in was a feudal one, and so they were used to taking kind of orders, if you will, from. They were used to a hierarchical system where people were telling them, "This is what you need to do, and here's how you need to do it." And that was very contrary to what we were trying to do, which is we were trying to create committees or groupings of people who lived there to have them tell us, here's what would be most appropriate. And there was a lot of resistance to that. They didn't feel comfortable. They also had the sense that Harvard was this prestigious place and that we ought to tell them. And so we had a bit of a cultural mix up there, and it took a little while to sort it through. And we made some interesting progress in those early days, but the path never quite got to where it needed to get to until we met Allison Tanek and Omer Tanek, who are on your screen, Allison with the bowl and Omer pointing out into the great beyond, if you will. And so Allison and Omer are married. Allison is from England and moved to Omer's village of Uvajala. And Allison wanted to help the people of Uvajala in a very meaningful way when she moved there. And she tried to do a few things like sell handicrafts and things along those lines, but it didn't work. And so what ended up happening is she had the thought to put out to the tourism world, what if we were to offer people an authentic sort of Kurdish village stay? Would people come? And amazingly, a few thousand people came, and Allison got connected with a couple of really important tour operators in Australia and New Zealand who brought people to the village. And somebody introduced us to Allison, a woman named Kate Clow, who runs the Cultural Roots Association in Turkey. And we talked to Allison and we said, look, we'd like you to help us do what you did in Uvajala, but across the Urfa region, including Haran. And Allison was up for the challenge, as was Omer. And Omer was from Uvajala. He knew the area as well as anyone. And so the two of them really guided us into the development of a very meaningful path. But all of these things were critical elements of getting started. Even though we had some mistakes along the way, they were mistakes that were important and they were meaningful and they helped us to learn as we went. So let me just share with you that there's a Jewish and a Christian narrative that some folks will know about, where Abraham was born in Ur of the Chaldees, and that's believed to be in southern Iraq, and that at some point Abraham was told by God to wander and to go and to discover yourself. And that wandering, he left with Sarah and Lot and his flock of sheep. And that wandering took him to Haran, which is in southeastern Turkey, about 40 kilometers, 50 kilometers from Şanlı Urfa, or from Urfa. If I say Şanlı Urfa, Şanlı just means great, so it means great Urfa. But Haran is the place that all of the three monotheistic faiths believe that Abraham heard the call from God to go forth. And the picture of Haran that you're seeing right now is the remains of Haran. And Haran is a fascinating place, not only for that, but if you see that tower in the distance there, that tower was built, it was a tower from a 4th century Islamic university, as was the arch there. And that tower is purportedly the first place where people measured the distance between the Earth and the Moon. And in fact, Haran was named, after the moon god in local lore. So Haran is a really important place. It's a place where Abraham sort of came of age, if you will, and this was the place where he started his journey. So the Jewish and Christian narrative is certainly a very strong one there, as is the Islamic narrative. Now, you heard in the video Mehmet Oymak talk about a cave that was the birthplace of Abraham. That cave is in the mosque. That mosque is known as the Ibrahimi Mosque. That cave the mosque is built around the cave of Abraham there. And what's fascinating, so this is in the heart of Urfa. Urfa is a city or a region of about 400,000 people. And Anisa before was talking about how, when you call out the name Ibrahim, lots of children turn around. Well, one of the stories that we heard early on is, there's about 400,000 people in the Urfa region, about 200,000 approximately are men, and about 60,000, from an estimate point of view, were named Ibrahim. So when you're walking through Urfa, you'll hear Ibrahim ringing through the narrow stone corridors and walkways. But the story of Abraham is imprinted in the city center. And what you're actually seeing is the city center of Urfa. And on your left-hand side, you see some columns. And these columns connect to a story. I mentioned earlier, my book of negotiation stories. Well, the story of Abraham is one that's filled with anecdotes and lessons. So one of the core stories for the city of Urfa is the story of Abraham and King Nimrod. So it turns out that King Nimrod was an idol worshiper, and Abraham was, let's just say that Abraham liked to push King Nimrod and was a bit of a pain in the neck and wanted to get him to change his thinking, if you will. And so he kept pushing and he kept challenging King Nimrod to the point where King Nimrod got so frustrated that he ordered Abraham to be captured and brought to the top of this mountain. So if you look to the right, you can see the stones behind the Ibrahimi Mosque. That's the view down from these pillars. So the story goes that King Nimrod got so frustrated with Abraham that he said, he said to his men, we're going to catapult Abraham off of the top of this cliff and into the fire pit below. Now, beyond the mosque, you see some trees, and the fire pits were purportedly down there. Also, Abraham had sort of fallen in love with King Nimrod's daughter, and that was another reason the king was not so fond of Abraham. So Abraham and King Nimrod's daughter were going to be cast into these fire pits. And when they were catapulted in the air, the story goes that the angels intervened and under God's tutelage and turned the fire and the sticks into water and carp. And Abraham and King Nimrod's daughter landed safely in the pools and continued to flourish and live there for a long time. And the story of this, connects in such a strong way that the park down below is on the weekends, people fill the park, and the Fish Lake, or Balikligal as it's known, is a sacred place. So people come to feed the carp. You can see some of them on the right. This is Balikligol on the left is at night. And those fish are sacred. If you were to take one, you can actually be put in jail. And so people don't do that. But they come and they worship this area in reverence to Abraham and the story that exists. So as I said, Abraham is not just a meme in people's mind. It's not just an image in people's mind or a historical connection. It's something that people feel on a daily basis when they live there because of the connection and the mosque and etc. So if we go back to Haran for one moment, there are some really extraordinary kind of imagery from the region that's unique to southeastern Turkey. One of them is what are called beehive houses. And beehive houses are in front of you, and they were built out of mud brick. And the very top of them are open because we're talking about the plains of the Levant here, and it gets quite hot in the summer. And so these mud brick houses had a way of staying cool in the summer, and they do get a little bit of snow in the winter. I've been out there when there's been snow on the ground, and so they stay warm in the winter because you can build a fire in, and there's a place for the smoke to go out. But the very top is open, and these beehive houses are generally speaking only really found in Haran, and are really quite extraordinary. I've had the chance to sleep in one at different points, and they really do stay cool in the winter. Stay cool in the summer and warmer in the winter. And there's a tremendous amount of handicraft that is also made in the area. This is one of my absolute favorite pictures. This was taken back in 2007-8 of a young girl who lives in Haran, and she's just really beautiful young girl who we found one day working on handicrafts in her village. And people there are doing lots of things to make ends meet. It is not a wealthy area of the country. A lot of families live on $1 or $2 a day, and this is actually why the Abraham Path in part was able to contribute, because when you have some walkers who are coming and perhaps spending 20 or 30 euro, that really helps people's livelihood, and it helps the children to not always have to work on the farm, but can actually go to school. And so it's enabled a number of families who are involved in the homestays to actually send their kids to school as part of the project. Another site that is truly a world-changing situation was a place called Göbekli Tepe. So Göbekli Tepe is believed to be about 10,000 years old. It was discovered and unearthed by a German archaeologist named Schmidt. And what's so extraordinary about this site is, first of all, it's 10,000 years old. So anything 10,000 years old is pretty extraordinary. But what's extraordinary about that is that the belief is that human beings only became sedentary or stayed in one place after up until 10,000 years ago. And so because this site was older than that, archaeologists wondered, well, if people were just hunter-gatherers at the time, why would it be that they would create a site like this? Why would they take the time? Because of course it was very time-consuming. If you look on the bottom image, you can see that these pillars were about 30 to 40 feet high, 10 meters high. But in addition, they had different animals etched into those pillars. And so archaeologists wondered, why would that be the case? Why would people who were hunter-gatherers take the time to do something like this? And it was, again, at the top of a hill that was substantial. And what they surmised was that these hunter-gatherers would come back to this spot year after year and pray to some kind of a god for the hunt. And that was unusual because they didn't think that there was any kind of religious notions or beliefs in a higher power before that. And so this site changed the way people viewed archaeology in general and viewed sort of human history. And it is that dramatic. And it is, excuse me, right along the path in Turkey. And lots of people go visit it every year. And it's quite extraordinary. I've been there a number of times. And, you know, hopefully down the road when you know, people can start going back, they'll put this on their itinerary, because when you stand there, you think to yourself, how is it that, you know, folks who didn't have a lot of tools, who didn't have a lot of ways of getting these huge, massive stones to a place like this, how did they do this? How long did it take, etc.? And so it's one of those enigmas that I think continues to sort of really challenge people to think about and to sort of imagine the commitment that people had in making something like this come to pass. And obviously, it was a very strong urge and pull to pray to somebody, or to take the time to, you know, speak to a higher power, to have a good hunt and to keep them safe, etc. Another part that we started to add into the path in subsequent years was Mount Nemrut. So Mount Nemrut is northeast of Uvagila and in the mountains. And it's actually, Mount Nemrut is about 7,000 feet high. It's a UNESCO World Site. And the summit has these very large statues. You can see my friend Omer Tanek there. And the statues were built around a royal tomb from the 1st century BC, actually built by King Antiochus. And the statues are about 8 to 9 meters high, so 26 to 30 feet high. And what's happened is that these statues, the heads have been removed from the bodies, and they've been sort of scattered around the site. But as I mentioned, this was sort of a burial tomb that was built back in that 1st century BC, and it's quite a fascinating place to behold. So again, you know, a lot of people don't know that all of these places exist in such a small area of southeastern Turkey. As you can see from the screen, you know, there are absolutely stunning sunsets. You know, when you have flat terrain and you get up into, say, a place like Mount Nemrut or some other places that are a bit elevated, you can see literally for hundreds, thousands of miles. And here's a majestic sunset, as well as some of the terrain that is kind of best described as rolling hills, if you would, and you get some amazing vistas because of that flat landscape that take you all the way, and you can look all the way into Syria from where you are. And I want to stop here with the village of Kasas. So Kasas, as I mentioned earlier, is an Alawite village, and Kasas is a unique little village that I had the pleasure of visiting, and we've got a wonderful homestay there that I hope people can get back to. Kasas is that Alawite village, and one of the tenets of Alawite culture is music. And music is so important to folks in Kasas that everybody has to play an instrument. Now you see me on the right-hand side here playing a violin. I did actually grow up for some years playing the violin. I will say I was readily put to shame by the by the lovely villagers who were trying to be kind to me, but then played after me and made the violin sing like I was not capable of doing. But you can see as well that a lot of them get together at night. They held an impromptu concert for us. One of the daughters of the gentleman, Iset, who's stoking the fire there, sang a beautiful song in English and was accompanied by all the folks playing their instruments. So, you know, to me, Turkey holds a special place in my heart because it took a very long time to get going. But as you can see, it's also a fascinating place with all of these unique contributions to the path that other places certainly have, but in different ways, right? Every place is unique and every place is distinct. And I think that, you know, someday if folks have an opportunity to travel out to that part of the world, they won't be disappointed as I certainly wasn't. So Anisa, I'm going to stop there and perhaps see what kind of questions or comments folks have, or if there's anything on your mind as well.
Well, thank you for that great presentation, Josh. I learned a lot. I learned a lot from reading people's questions, and I'll share some of them with you in a moment. But I do want to say we had hoped we'd have some of our colleagues from Turkey on this program with us. You know, that we recognize that we are not the authentic voice speaking for, and we're speaking for the Abraham Path Initiative here. And down the road, we will certainly have our associates and colleagues from Turkey joining us to talk about the difference that this organization has made and that the trails have made for them, and how we could improve what we do. Because as you've indicated, this is a long-term plan, very long-term plan. So thank you for that, Josh. We did get a couple of questions in here, and I'm gonna throw one of them at you now, which notes how Göbekli Tepe certainly predates Abraham. So the question came, you know, what would be the significance of that area to Abraham? And I have some thoughts on that, but let me ask you to take that first.
Yeah, well, first of all, you know, one of the things that we learned early on is that there's you know, Abraham is a myth. There's no historical evidence that Abraham existed in the traditional sense. There are sites, there are places, etc. And so the path sought to not only, you know, generally follow the route of Abraham, because people say, well, how did you know Abraham went there? And for us, it was much more of a, you know, there are waypoints. You know, we know that Abraham had rumored to have been in Haran, and similarly with Urfa. And so it's distinctly possible that he went by these places, and for us, that was what guided us as we sort of developed all of this. And you're right, that site predates Abraham by many, many thousands of years. But when you have, you know, this site is, or you know, the path is also very much about the history and the culture. And so just because it, you know, in one sense wasn't necessarily associated with Abraham, it still helps to show people, you know, how this region developed and why, etc. And so, you know, so we were always, you know, when you develop a route like this, it's trying to utilize what you know from the historical texts, but it's also looking at, oh wow, these are really fascinating sites as well that are right nearby, and that would certainly educate people and show them a different part of the world in a different way. So we always tried to include that, as well as the, you know, the landscapes and things along those lines. So
yeah,
your thoughts.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, people have always been curious about the past as well as our future, and I'm just to know that that there were sites predating Abraham, and perhaps they didn't have Facebook, they didn't have, you know, FaceTime or webinars, but in their way they would study and see what was it that came before, and so that his notion of a monotheistic God, of a you know, that there's only one God, didn't come from nowhere, you know, in the mythology or in reality. That would be an evolving notion. And so I think this is part of our shared human history. And that's one of the things that really excites me about working in that region. My family is from Iraq originally, and there's a huge amount of human history in what we call the Fertile Crescent or ancient Mesopotamia. And sometimes we don't recognize the depth of the impact of all of these cultural developments on ourselves.
That's right.
So it's a great question, because it gives us a chance to talk about the context of who they were then and who we are now.
That's right.
And there was also a question about, and we're coming about, move very quickly through this hour. What are some of the milestones we would look for by 2030, for example, to see if the path or our work has sort of moved in the direction we want to go? Now, of course, we're talking about a region that moves almost as slowly as geologic time, right? But to say that, you know, within 10 years of our existence, we supported the development of 1,000 miles of walking trail, that's a pretty big achievement. And I would think, you know, we'd want to at least double that by 2030. There are lots of areas where the legend of Abraham lives, and we haven't got trails everywhere. Right now, we're working in the Kurdish region of northern Iraq and developing trail there. And we've got 200 kilometers sort of marked, not fully marked, but in our sights. And then we want to have about 400 miles. So we do believe, obviously, that there will be a chance to walk physically again. But what are some of the markers you would pull, Josh, to share with our guests?
Well, I mean, I would love to continue to see, parts of the path that haven't been developed that people are interested in developing, to do that. I would love to.
Syria, right? Saudi Arabia.
Right, exactly.
Where the stories live.
Yeah, and I would love to see, even in as you were talking about in northern Iraq, the ability to connect that to the path in Turkey. It's a few hundred miles, but it could be done. And so I think it's just, and I would love to see more and more people having this experience. I think that's the key is, that, and it can be the physical experience, or it can be engaging in things like this, where people are learning and people are sort of maybe exploring anew what it is they know about the region. Because from my point of view, again, if this is really trying to help people to see those from different cultures, different beliefs, different perspectives, I think the Abraham Path does that in a way that is unique, and it does it, what I would hope is also a very humble way, where we're not trying to do anything other than to share the history and different perspectives and ways in which people have developed. I mean, one of the things that was always fascinating to me is when we would go to the villages and talk to people in Turkey and Jordan, wherever it was, and the villagers would say to us, why would people want to come here? Like, we live in a small village in a very remote part of Turkey. And I would say, believe it or not, they're interested in your way of life and in your identity and in the way you do things. And when they heard that, there was a real affirmation of them, and that the world cared about them. I mean, you heard, in the video how, the kids got excited because they wanted to know where the next group of people were coming from. So if somebody shows up from Italy or Germany or Norway, and what's interesting, and I had a father in Palestine once say to me, what I really appreciate, the economic development certainly helps, but what I also really appreciate is that when my kids see people from these different places come, he said, one day my son turned to me when a group just left and said, those people don't seem that different than us. And I think that's it. I mean, I think that's the essence of it, is that there's lots of things that we're told about others that divide us, and we're supposed to keep believing all of that. And I think the path sort of says, well, wait a minute, not so fast. Like, there's a lot that unites us, and there's a lot that we share. And I think when you sit in a village that is really impoverished and the people are generous, the hospitality of Abraham comes flowing from whatever they have, it's impossible not to change your view of things. And I think that's what I'd like to see, is that continued sort of, connection, whether it's, one at a time or what, for the path and for the future. And again, of course, we all want to see it open and to be able to keep helping those folks on the ground and getting people around the world to come and see.
Yeah. And one at a time takes a long time. So we ask each of you to please be ambassadors and messengers for us, and let people know that we have that there's this educational opportunity available. We host these webinars every other week, and feel free to share the invitations and let us know who might be interested in coming in. And you can go to our website, www.abrahampath.org, and sign up to get information from the Abraham Path Initiative. And also, if you become a donor, we will automatically include you in all of the messages that come out. And we'd certainly appreciate that also, to keep our webinars going, for example. And that's, again, the 3 W's, abrahampath.org. Josh, thank you so much for this really enlivening and interesting tour in Turkey with you today. eventually what we'd like to see is, as our founder often says, a shift in perspective on the region from a region of terror to a region of tourism, and from a sense of hostility to a sense of hospitality and understanding of hospitality in the region. So those are our long-term goals, and 2030 may be too soon for that all to happen. We will see. We have a video to share with you. Oh, you had something else, Josh? Please.
I just wanted to thank everybody for tuning in. And, I know this is going to be recorded, and we'd really love it if you'd share it, with your networks of folks so that they can learn a bit. And, as Anisa's mentioned, the organization runs from donations from folks like you. And so whatever you could give would be tremendously helpful, and we'd be deeply grateful to you for that in whatever it looks like. So thank you so much, and please do continue to tune in.
Thank you. And we're sending you out with a video from that Kisas, the Alawite town in Turkey. It's a song sung by the daughter of one of our homestay host families, and it's set to old footage, old film footage. So enjoy, and thanks for coming.
Düşlerin parlayıp söndüğü yerde buluşmak seninle bir akşamüstü, umarsız şarkılar dudağında bir yarım ezgi, sığınmak gözlerine sığınmak bir akşamüstü. Gözlerin bir çığlık, bir yaralı haykırış. Gözlerin bu gece çok uzaktan geçen bir gemi. Gözlerin bir çığlık, bir yaralı haykırış. Gözlerin bu gece çok uzaktan geçen bir gemi. Bir orman bir gece kar altındayken, çocuksu uçarı koşmak seninle. Elini avucunda bulup yitirmek, yitirmek. Sığınmak ellerine, sığınmak bir gece vakti. Ellerin bir martı, telaşlı ve ürkek. Ellerin fırtınada çırpınan bir beyaz yelken. Ellerin bir martı, telaşlı ve ürkek. Ellerin fırtınada çırpınan bir beyaz yelken. Bir kenti böylece